For I decided to choose chapter 18. So the title is improving the collaboration between enterprise architects and agile teams, and it is a multiple case study. So let's get started. So for the agenda, I'll be giving first the introduction and background, so at least we'll have an idea what's the difference between an enterprise architect and a agile team. And then let's go forward with the research of the case study, and then the tactics that the companies have provided, and some final thoughts on the last part of the presentation. And then, so for the introduction and background, so for the overview of the case study, try to imagine that the enterprise, or most likely, faces some challenges due to advancement of technology. And one of this is based on the case study is the adoption of the agile methods on a larger scale. And try to imagine upon scaling, if you have already a established enterprise architect team or department, it must it always be a non-smooth collaboration between the two. This is because they have different set of mindsets and way or perspective when it comes to delivering products to their clients. But yeah, we will gonna see how the case study, how they were able to give the solutions behind the tension between the enterprise architect and the agile team. So try to imagine the enterprise architect. Their role is basically to achieve unity of the whole enterprise and then align the technology strategy with the business strategy. So first, they usually maintain the holistic vision of the enterprise, and then harmonizing the requirements across the large scale projects in different departments or within the whole organization itself, and then guiding the agile teams through the business and technical roadmaps. So in the screen, you can see that how mess is this, and then as an enterprise architect, this is your vision. So that is one of their primary roles. So, for example, in a day-to-day or uh, day-to-day job of an enterprise architect, so usually they talk to executives. So, for example, chief information officer, uh, they talk to them. For example, they wanted to know the business process of a certain component or a certain system within their business. And then from that, you can move forward in knowing the information flow of that business processes. And then from that information flow, you may possibly create a data architect from that. And then from that data architect, you can standard or make a standard for example, GPDR, the data privacy of those customers, how those data are being stored within the database, how is it connecting to other database, yeah, something like that. And then, so because you already have the data, you need some kind of application interface. So this could be different tools or programming languages or framework that will represent the data stored. So for example, if you're familiar with dashboards visualization with an web application, though probably as an enterprise architect, you'll be giving the agile team the standards for creating or building an application to represent those data. And then that application should be stored somewhere in a certain infrastructure or technology. So it could be deployed into a cloud or in a premise or some kind of a hybrid. And then, of course, as an enterprise architect, from business process up to technology architecture, uh, you're gonna manage also the program because some applications or components or systems, they have this life cycle. So basically, there will become a time that application will become a legacy application. And then the architects, because there's a lot of integration within components and different departments, they need a body of knowledge. So that's why they have this governance where all of the documentation, standards, policies, and procedures are stored. So they call this a repository or a body of knowledge. So if ever someone tries to come in as a new enterprise architect for that department, he or she will be able to get easily on board. Yes, so basically that's the enterprise architect. And then for the mindset of an agile team, so basically you're gonna hear some terminology like waterfall, or in it's a it's a set of phases. Well, it is a non-negotiable. You need to finish first things first, or the steps before jumping into another. And it's a linear path, which basically for example, building a house, which is really compatible. But in experience, this process is has a lot of failure based on studies and experiences. So that's why they was able to come up the word agile for agility. So agile, as you can see on the screen, is some kind of a iteration. Start with planning of small chunks of tasks, and then getting feedback from the people. So by experience, agile fits the software development because of its intangibility. So for that, you can explore and experiment until until you're able to deliver the values that your customers needs. So giving an example, so um, agile, it is usually in my experience, I see it as a mindset. So having that mindset, they have this agile manifesto, wherein you're gonna hear interactions over process and tools, working software over comprehensive documentation, collaboration over contract negotiation, and I believe the last one is responding to change, we cannot really um, which is really normal within the software development. So that's why within that mindset, the agile, they were able to create a different frameworks from it. So the most popular one is Scrum, and then also XP is also mentioned in the case study, and then Kanban. So probably most of you are already familiar with Kanban, and then the Lean principles. So these are the mindset of the both teams in a high level overview. And then for the tension between the enterprise architect and the agile team, because of their differences, their different perspective. So let's try to see what's their differences. So for example, the enterprise architect, they take things on a top-down approach perspective because they focus on the long-term goals and strategies of the business. Not unlike the agile team, they usually focus on the fast prototyping or short ambitions to satisfy the business users or stakeholders. So one thing that the enterprise architect doesn't like about that is, for example, our technical debts. It could lead, into a design negligence in the long term, if that's always the case. Another thing is for their differences. Most enterprise architect, they have this big design approach wherein the agile they deliver frequently with business values to the software project. So another one is the enterprise architect have this command and control, especially the chief architects. Not unlike the agile team, they have this mindset of servant leadership, wherein you focus on the software development, and there are some roles within the agile that will help you to achieve the goals of that you're doing. So between these tensions, that we have already an idea between the enterprise architect and the agile team and their tensions, their differences. We'll now move forward with the research of the case study. So for the case study goal, the goal of this study is to explore the challenges. So we already mention some of their differences and their tension. And then there's challenges. We'll see how they will collaborate within Agile team. And this is only a exploratory that bears a descriptive and explanatory character. Also, this case study has investigated five German companies and four units of analysis that allow for cross-scale analysis. And this four units of analysis, or in other words, the challenges, is first is the formulation and application architecture principle, and then the decision-making process of architecture related topics to enterprise architects boards, and then the new role of enterprise architect management assisting the agile teams, and then the last one is the contribution of the enterprise management in supporting large scale agile development and diverse. So these are the companies that the case study have interviewed. So these are German companies. So they aim to shed the light on this field of tension between the enterprise architects and the agile teams. As you can see on the table, they collected data from semi-structured interviews and workshops. And almost companies, they have at least one senior executive, enterprise architect, and one agile team member to gain diverse perspective in this field of tension. So also, it's just mentioned that the interviewers have a face-to-face meeting between these two, at least two research per present. So let's move forward. So this is the table where how the company what do you call this, adopted the applied scaling of of the Scrum of a certain enterprise. So as you can see, they have used less Spotify model, safe. Uh, if you're familiar with Scrum, so basically Scrum focuses on small teams. So for example, I'm personally familiar with less. Less means you can basically take this Scrum framework and upsize it for an enterprise. So in other words, less is Scrum only bigger. And another difference is, for example, uh, in a small team, usually teams there are focusing on delivering the project. Not unlike in the Scrum, there are different feature teams within the Agile team, wherein they collaborate more and they own the system itself. So we're in the collaboration you're gonna see based on the case study. So for that, let's try to see the detailed unit of analysis and the tactics to improve the collaboration. Uh, yeah. So first is the establishing the architecture principles. So here are some of the analysis that they have found. So low commitment of agile team regarding the implementation of architecture principles due to intrinsic motivation, acceptance issues, conflicting goals to deliver business value frequently, lack of appropriate tools and automated mechanism for controlling compliance with an agile team. Also, the lack of knowledge and understanding of why principles are important and why they should be considered by agile teams. And the last one is poor communication between existing and architecture principles towards agile team. So based on the case study, um, for the first tactic to solve those issues is define architecture principle as quality gates policies. So that solves the architecture principles. So companies, for example, the retail co within the case study uses the continuous integration and continuous delivery. So let's say continuous integration. This is the central code repository of teams wherein they work simultaneously. So back in the days, for example, you have check in your code, then you're gonna email your team. Not unlike today, once you check in a certain code, So, for example, if there is a policies within the security, checking the licenses of the open source software that is being used, those policies can be integrated with these quality gates, and then it provides an API wherein the enterprise architect can inject new policies for different stages of the continuous integration and continuous deployment of the project. So, for example, I believe build will check if any unit test fails and if the project builds. Smoke test, for example, if the web application is running after a release. Function test, let's say, for example, UI test. Integration runs an automated test that links to a test plan where enterprise architect can usually investigate if the test plans are correct. And then change management, wherein, for example, in a work team or work item, once you have successfully checked in your code, um, related work items will be tagged based on those changes. So yeah, nowadays, if this is being implemented in your enterprise or organization, so try to imagine if you're the developer, you check in your code, then eventually everything will be tested from the, let's say, data policies, static analysis of the codes, coding standards, and different stages. And then you will be having some feedback where it's the part that you need to redo or undo on your check-in. So this is one of the tactics that the companies has is doing, especially the Retail Co, a German company. Now for the another unit case analysis, number two is the enterprise architect boards. So usually they need a decision making process for the architecture related topics. So uh, to make it a detail, so the EA governance tend to decide over the heads of agile teams without knowing their concerns. So lack of involvement of agile teams in relevant architecture process and discussion. And the last one is the tedious EA governance procedure slows down the development speed of agile team. So for the solution or the tactic that they have done is enterprise communities or practices for architecture. So before I start, I would like to give an example. So for example, within this Scrum or less, these the I would call this the scaled Scrum, wherein you already have different teams. There will come a time, for example, a database expert will guide different sets of teams within the department. He will act as an expert and give advice to other teams. So I think when you say community of practice for architecture, it's just like wherein there are some expert there, and then this is usually an open wherein interested parties are not forced to participate. So in the case study, one of the company is also Retail Co. So in them, this is a mandatory for all architects. So they also base their interview for architects and agile teams. So to have an acceptance rate. So for example, to contribute DVD architecture principles, uh, let's say for example they have this new tools or architecture principles they would like to use in a daily basis. So they need to set the things to kick off, then determine and then elaborate the problem. Then it's just like a proof of concept wherein you discuss your solution to the problems that you're facing within your team, and then eventually it will be published, and then it will be part of the book of standards of the enterprise architect. So anyone who will have a problem on that component or system in the near future, they can easily investigate or read the documents from that and learn from the different mistakes from the other EA who have solved those problems. So those are the solutions that they have provided of scene. And then another tactic for this is the enterprise communities of practices for architecture. So this basically addresses the challenges of tedious EA governance that slows down the development phases of agile teams. This actually makes a decision making model for classifying based on the importance and impact. Again, based on the case study, companies they categorize their decision based on urgency, financial, organizational scope, importance, strategic importance. So, also, for example, an architect on a single team. Uh, for example, there's you need an external libraries. The agile teams are allowed to make decision within themselves without having to include the further EI governance bodies. So, in my experience, so for example, when we create application, um, we eventually use some third-party libraries outside uh, of the libraries that the company is using. And then after you have chosen or back up your story, why you have chosen this, you have checked the licenses of the open source, what are the probable impact. Uh, there will be a time that the EA team will eventually study your documentation, and they will try to see if there's a risk on using those components or libraries, and they will try to escalate if or if there are some pensions or issues that needed to be changed. They eventually make a risk mitigation documentation, so later on, from that experience, they learn from the mistakes and improve on the next time. So in my experience, for example, open source, usually enterprise are not really open with that, but as time goes on, now many companies are now accepting the open source licenses, technologies, and from that, I've seen that many enterprises already have created some mitigation risk for different open source projects. So those are one of the things I've seen in the role of the enterprise architects. Now, for another uh, tactic, sorry. Okay, so for another um, unit analysis, which is number three, is the role of the enterprise architects. So basically, on the case study, they say that lack of a capacity of enterprise architect make it difficult for them to deliver the services on time and appropriate quality. So lack of time does not allow them to support the agile team, lack of knowledge and understanding why principles are important and why they should be considered by agile teams. And then enterprise architect encounter acceptance problems and are perceived as a disturbance by the agile team. So for these issues or unit case analysis, uh, the tactic is Scrum Ban for optimizing workflow and improving delivered services for the role of enterprise architects. So the word Scrum Ban came from the word Scrum and then Kanban. So that's why you're gonna hear Kanban, where it is actually a visual representation of what's happening within the agile team. So within this case study, so the company published in Sureco applied Scrum Ban within their enterprise architect team. So probably because if you want to understand your agile team, you need to also to adapt. And I believe that agile is not just for software development; it could be applied into other teams also. So the EA team of the company, Public Insure, so they follow the basic practices of Scrum. So they have this daily Scrum, wherein the EA team have the understanding what work has to be done. And for the Scrum roles and product owner roles, it's taken by the head of the enterprise architect management team. And then, of course, they're practicing also the self-organized. And then they also have this um, Scrum Ban, wherein you can see the backlogs, the task, what's in progress. Yeah, so basically, you at least you have the visual representation. So, so that's the what do you call this? What they have done as an organization. So for that, at least they have an idea what the agile works, and then they can at least understand the agile people under them. And then for the number for unit analysis, so decision making process. So lack of knowledge of the enterprise architects makes the artifacts provided less relevant to the agile teams, and lack of regular feedback between enterprise architects and agile teams. And then communication between agile teams and enterprise architects is facilitated in a third person, leading to loss of information, dissatisfaction, and misinterpretations. Uh, so for the tactic number five, so they have this conducting architecture spikes for assisting agile teams. So for the company Carco, ITco, and Public Insureco, they conduct this architectural spikes to provide a support to the agile team. Uh, I believe this is possible also within the agile team. When you say spike, it means investigation, wherein you investigate the root cause of the problem. But in the perspective of an enterprise architect, this tactic addresses the challenges of the artifacts, so that the agile team can understand where did artifact, what's the history, um, what are the solutions, or what are the mistakes from that point of view. And then, for example, if there are some unknown requirements on the agile team, the EA team will eventually make a spike if there are some issues. And then also, if you're familiar with the extreme programming, which is also one of the framework of Agile, they have this practice called Sprint Zero. As it goes, one of its goals is to set the initial architectural skeleton for the Agile team. So not everyone uses extreme programming, but yeah, if you're familiar with Sprint Zero, this is where you start the architectural things wherein so the Agile team can kick off with the development. If there are some issues, everything will be set here, and then you can kick off. And then for the summary and conclusion, so the case study, and they have these thoughts that the enterprise architect must leave the ivory tower and attend agile events. This is probably because you need to understand your team. So this eventually changed the perception of an agile team about EA. So basically, I believe they have written this because most likely agile teams is having a hard time communicating with the EA people. And then the EA architectural spikes will eventually increase to address architectural issues of the team, which is which is really very good because it will provide progress for the agile team. And then the other one is EA team are increasingly using agile and lean practices. So usually EA people are usually have this mindset of linear approach, but I believe they have this framework to graph, and then I believe they were able to integrate agile with that framework. And then another thought for the case study, the organization must protect the agile team from the traditional EA governance by empowering teams by community governments to make architectural decision. So for me, I have experienced this, and I believe this is really powerful for the rest of the organization. So if, for example, if there's a leader on or an expert in a certain technology, he can communicate and educate the teams all across for that certain framework or technology. And then Another one is to another thoughts from them is to proactively support agile team with appropriate up-to-date models, tools, integration into the development, such as, for example, the CI/CD, or also known as DevOps, and documentation of EA must be automized as much as possible. Um, yeah, so for the last thought and summary, they have conducted this. Uh, as for the limitation, they have conducted this study with only 5 units of cases from different industries. So for in-depth understanding of this field, however, these companies listed doesn't fully represent all industries. So that's why a further case study is needed or encouraged to fully understand some other areas of other enterprises. Thank you very much. That's it for me. If you have any questions, just let me know.